everyone, and welcome to our Trauma 101 module. The people you're seeing on the screen here all played a role in the creation of this module, and we want to take a moment to introduce ourselves to you and tell you a little bit about the work that we do and how we connect to this Trauma 101 module that you're about to go through. So my name is Bernadette Burkle, and I work for the CSIU. My title there is Chief Outreach Officer, and my role is to try to make connections between needs of the school district and needs of the community so that we can all support each other. And mental health and trauma is certainly an issue that we've been discussing a lot as a group, and we wanted to provide this module so that districts had a starting place for teachers to gain some vocabulary and understanding. And so now I'd like to introduce you to Tim Noster. Tim?
Hi, folks. So I'm Tim Noster from the McDowell Institute in the College of Education at Bloomsburg University. I serve as the executive director there, along with a colleague of mine, Danielle Lemson, who's the director of school-based behavioral health. The McDowell Institute's role in this process is that we're involved with both pre-service educator training as well as collaborating with all the members in the Community of Practice on Social Emotional Wellness within the CSIU region to provide supports to school districts and communities in the area to enhance the social, emotional, and behavioral wellness of kids. So this trauma module that's been developed has really been a joint effort between not just those of us that are pictured right now, but even a broader community of practice with the intent of really trying to provide easy access to things that reflect evidence-based approaches to trauma-informed practice. So it's a pleasure to be with you and enjoy the module.
Thanks, Tim. Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne Troutman. I'm with Greater Susquehanna Valley United Way, where I'm the president and CEO. I'm also a trauma trainer, and part of our interest in ensuring that our community at large gets this training is because understanding the basics of trauma is the first step in building a more resilient community. Education really is difficult for people to endure, take on, if they have other issues, underlying issues that are consistently drawing their attention. And so we make sure that families, communities, and schools pay attention to social emotional wellness of everyone first. If we're able to do that, only then can we build a more successful future and a more resilient, vibrant, and healthy community.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne. Emily, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Smith. I am one of the educational consultants with the CSIU. And my training in trauma started a few years back when we realized that it was affecting a lot of our students. And Misty and I she'll introduce herself, we work primarily with the special education population, but not only does trauma affect that group, it goes beyond that. So when we started to dive into trauma and provide some support and training to the staff we worked with, we realized that it would be great to connect with the wider community, like Tim and Joanne both mentioned. So that's how we got involved in the community of practice and the development of this module. So we're glad to be with you and be part of that.
Thank you, Emily. Misty.
Hey everyone, I'm Misty Harris. I am an educational consultant at the CSIU with Emily. I too started a few years ago with Emily and just the training of trauma. And I'm just super interested in the science behind it, the mental health issues that are surrounding us, not just as an educational consultant, but also as a parent. And I just think that getting this group of people together and having them be able to work together and having so many different lenses that we can hopefully provide training that all of you need and can then use in your everyday lives.
Thank you, Misty.
Welcome to this orientation module of Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care for Educators. Completion of this module should provide you with a basic orientation to trauma and trauma-informed care practices. Access to this module has been made available through the collaborative efforts of the McDowell Institute in the College of Education at Bloomsburg University, the Greater Susquehanna Valley and Columbia-Montour County United Ways, and the Central Susquehanna Intermediate Unit, with other partners associated with the Social Emotional Behavioral Wellness Community of Practice of the CSIU for students pre-K to 12th grade. There are several objectives for this learning module. At the end of this module, it is our hope that participants will be able to define the term trauma, as well as ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. Participants should be able to distinguish between a variety of types of trauma. Also, participants should be able to describe how brain development is impacted by trauma, as well as how the brain reacts to stress based on those traumatic experiences. Participants will also be given knowledge related to how an individual's behavior may reflect the trauma they have experienced. An overview of trauma-informed care is also a part of this training module, as well as an introduction to strategies to support the resilience of individuals that have experienced trauma. In this first section of the training module, we'll be developing a definition of trauma that will frame the rest of your learning today. We all experience some level of stress on a regular basis, whether at work or at home. Daily stressors such as deadlines, meetings, traffic, and juggling family needs are common for most of us. We also face more intense experiences like illness, caring for an aging parent, ongoing stress at work, financial pressures, or dealing with a major loss. Even positive experiences like getting married, moving, or starting a new job can cause some level of strain. In many cases, we have the capacity to cope with a range of life experiences, expected or unexpected, mild or intense. Then what is trauma? There are a multitude of definitions for trauma that go beyond these stressful experiences we mentioned. Let's explore a few as we develop our definition for this module. One definition given by Groves and Betsy in 2003 says trauma is any event that undermines a child's sense of physical or emotional safety or poses a threat to the safety of the child's parents or caregivers. A broader definition of trauma is given by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. This definition of trauma states that it is a more overwhelming event than a person would ordinarily be expected to encounter. In this training, the term trauma is used to describe an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, overwhelms our ability to cope, and has lasting adverse effects on a person's mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Traumatic events that students may face at school and in their families and communities come in many forms and range from one-time incidents such as an accident, a natural disaster, the loss of a parent or peer, or a single experience of violence, to experiences that are chronic or even generational, such as abuse, neglect, chronic bullying, exposure to family or community violence, or the cumulative and historical impact of poverty, racism, or discrimination. Whether an event or circumstance is traumatic depends on the person's experience of the event. We cannot say that a particular situation, witnessing violence, for example, is always traumatic for everyone. Whether an event is experienced as traumatic is influenced by many factors, including our internal coping resources, our external supports, and broader community, cultural, and societal factors that shape how we understand and respond to our experiences. Immediate reactions to traumatic events include feelings of fear, helplessness, and loss of control. Traumatic experiences that may have short and long-term effects on health and well-being, and can alter how youth view themselves, others, and the world around them by challenging their belief that the world is a safe place, that other people can be trusted, and that they are worthy of care and protection. Students feeling the effects of trauma may show them in their work and behavior at school. Having shared the information thus far, it's also important to view this understanding in context with our kids in school. In terms of the prevalence of trauma, between 50 and 67% of children report experiencing a traumatic event by the age of 16. In other words, as few as 1 out of every 2, or up to as many as 2 out of every 3 students report experiencing a traumatic event by the time they are eligible to obtain their driver's license. Further, it is common for children and adolescents to experience more than a single traumatic event during this same time frame. This is a very high number of individuals that are statistically likely to have experienced a traumatic event. Reflect now on the students with whom you have contact. Do you know students that have experienced trauma? How likely is it that you are working with students that have experienced at least one traumatic event without you even having knowledge of that information? This second section will share information related to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs refer to inherently disruptive experiences in childhood that produce significant and potentially damaging levels of stress and associated physical changes. Adverse childhood experiences is a term coined by Vincent Felitti, Robert Anda, and their colleagues in their seminal study conducted from 1995 to 1997. ACEs are a subset of childhood adversities in 7 categories: physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, having a mother who was treated violently, living with someone who was mentally ill, living with someone who abused alcohol or drugs, and incarceration of a member of the household. Researchers found that the more ACEs adults reported from their childhoods, the worse their physical and mental health outcomes were. For example, heart disease, substance misuse, depression. The term ACEs has since been adopted to describe varying lists of adversities. The current ACEs study, funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, include parental divorce or separation and emotional and physical neglect. Other studies have added experiences of social disadvantage, like economic hardship, homelessness, community violence, discrimination, historical trauma. No single ACEs list defines or identifies all childhood adversities, but those that do not include adversity related to social disadvantage are likely to overlook children in specific racial or ethnic groups who are disproportionately affected. The video you're about to watch is very effective in defining and explaining the impact of ACEs on a person's life. It's a TED Talk delivered by pediatrician Nadine Burke-Harris. The video is 16 minutes long. Feel free to take notes as it's packed with information, but we will review her key points in subsequent slides.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California, and together we opened a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, "Dr. Burke, have you seen this?" In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior, and that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
Take a look at this image of the pair of aces tree. This image grew out of a need to illustrate the relationship between adversity within a family and adversity within a community. The leaves on the tree represent the symptoms of ACEs that are easily recognized in clinical, educational, and social service settings. such as food insecurity, housing instability, or a mother grappling with depression. Adverse childhood experiences can increase a person's risk for chronic stress and adverse coping mechanisms and result in lifelong chronic illnesses such as depression, heart disease, obesity, and substance abuse, as you just heard in the last video. Physical or sexual violence and abuse or neglect are often less obvious, but can exist as chronic stressors for individuals. Notice that this tree is planted in poor soil that is steeped in systemic inequities, robbing it of nutrients necessary to support a thriving community. Adverse community environments, such as a lack of affordable and safe housing, community violence, systemic discrimination, and limited access to social and economic mobility, compound one another, creating a negative cycle of ever-worsening soil that result in withering leaves in the tree. While not part of the formalized ACEs studies that have been conducted over the years, there are also associated forms of adverse community experiences that align with a number of ACEs as depicted in this slide. This is not to suggest that it is appropriate to equate these two types of ACEs, but rather that it can be helpful to consider community contexts in relationship with the experiences of children within those communities. The ACEs study has been completed and replicated several times. These results show data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention from 2016. This data set shows that approximately 64% of those individuals surveyed experienced one or more adverse childhood experience. This study is a representation of how common it is for people to experience adverse childhood experiences. Keep in mind, the ACEs study was a study conducted on adults. There's no need to ask children about their experiences, and ACEs data should not be used as a screener for interventions and services. In this next section of the module, we'll be discussing the various types of trauma an individual may face. Trauma comes in a variety of types and levels of severity. The four basic types of trauma we will look at include acute trauma, chronic trauma, complex trauma, and historical or racial trauma. An acute trauma is described as one that occurs as a single isolated incident. This does not mean that trauma has any less impact on the individual. Acute trauma could include an event like a car accident or experiencing an earthquake. Chronic trauma is trauma that occurs repeatedly over a prolonged amount of time. This type of trauma can include ongoing or repeated abuse or neglect. Complex trauma is a trauma from multiple events over the course of time, typically beginning at an early age. This might include trauma such as a family experiencing a house fire, which then requires the family to move, leave their familiar community supports, and possibly results in a change in family structure. This can have a multitude of effects on an individual and can be considered complex trauma. COVID-19 may result in complex trauma for individuals over time. The next two slides talk about more specific types of trauma. Please take a moment to read through them. Please read the definition of historical trauma on the screen. Historical trauma may require a little more discussion for complete understanding. For example, the negative effects of violent colonization, dislocation, and assimilation policies, such as forced placement in boarding schools among American Indian and Alaska Native communities, continue to manifest in current struggles with substance abuse, suicide, violence, and a distrust of systems such as education. For communities of color, the effects of slavery, segregation, racism, and discrimination may manifest as feelings of hopelessness, increased anger and violence toward self and others, internalized racism, and mistrust of social institutions and systems. Other groups that continue to be impacted by historical trauma include Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, Japanese American survivors of World War II internment camps, immigrant populations, and members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning communities. The cumulative effects of these forms of trauma on youth, families, and communities may manifest in a number of ways that compromise student engagement and success in school. As discussed earlier, the term complex trauma describes both exposure to multiple traumatic events from an early age and the immediate and long-term effects of these experiences over the course of development. Examples include chronic abuse, neglect, or exposure to family violence, as well as other forms of violent victimization experienced from an early age without adequate adult support to manage these experiences. This type of trauma is particularly devastating because it occurs during critical periods of brain development, before a child has had the chance to develop strong, positive ways to cope with stress. Youth with complex trauma are likely to exhibit a range of behavioral and academic difficulties that require additional intervention by adults in the school community. We'll talk more about what this looks like in Part 3 of the training. We will now discuss brain development and the effects of trauma. Trauma can have a significant impact on brain development in a child. This section will briefly describe how a typical brain develops and how that could be impacted by trauma. If trauma occurs during a child's development when a specific part of the brain is in the process of developing, such as the area of the brain that controls the fight or flight reaction that we heard earlier in the video, that child may have long-term effects that cause them to choose fight or flight anytime they sense danger, whether real or imagined. The brain develops from the bottom up, starting with the brainstem, then the limbic system, or emotional brain, and the neocortex, or thinking brain, to support more complex skills. Early childhood is the period of greatest growth in the size of brain structures and the number of connections between areas in the brain. It is estimated that the brain makes 700 to 1,000 new connections per second in the first few years of life. By age 3, the brain has grown to 80% of its adult size. Over time, the brain becomes faster and more efficient at communicating information across different areas. And through a process called pruning, the brain recognizes and streamlines connections, eliminating those that are the least useful. The emotional brain and the thinking brain become more mature and better coordinated as children learn how to use cognitive skills to manage emotional reactions. The thinking brain continues to develop through adolescence and into early adulthood. Brain development is influenced by the interaction between genes, environmental conditions, and personal experiences. Genes provide the blueprint for brain development and help form brain cells and build connections between different parts of the brain. How these plans unfold depends on environmental factors and personal experiences. The environment has a strong influence on brain development, beginning before birth and continuing through childhood. This includes level of exposure to toxic substances such as lead, mercury, pesticides, and drugs like alcohol, nicotine, and cocaine that can disrupt early brain development. Experiences such as quality of parent-child relationships, degree of support and connections in families, schools, and communities, and exposure to stress and adversity will influence brain development. Healthy brain development is fostered by adults who are attuned to children's needs and can respond in caring, consistent, and nurturing ways to protect youth from threat and help them tolerate stress. Relatedly, it is important to keep in mind that early childhood through adolescence is a period of increased brain plasticity, meaning the brain is more easily able to adapt and change and acquire new learning in response to experiences. As a result, this is a period of increased sensitivity to the effect of personal and environmental circumstances on sensory, motor, language, and social and emotional development. The brain adapts to whatever conditions are presented, either positive or negative. Positive brain development is supported by a healthy physical environment and access to safe, stable relationships that help children realize their potential. Schools play a significant role in supporting positive brain development by creating safe and supportive environments, promoting positive relationships, and building skills for supportive resilience. Some level of stress is healthy for a growing child. Being challenged to engage in new experiences and learn new skills is a critical aspect of healthy development. Even negative stressors for children, such as losing a parent or parent separation or divorce, can be tolerable with the right support. However, exposure to chronic trauma, such as recurrent abuse, chronic neglect or deprivation, and ongoing exposure to violence within families or communities overwhelms a child's system and has damaging, lasting effects on development. Strong, frequent, and prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of support is referred to as toxic stress response. Being in a constant state of fight or flight changes how the brain operates in ways that can have significant negative effects on all aspects of development across the lifespan. The brain responds to these circumstances by organizing itself around surviving, at the expense of developing skills associated with positive development and resilience. Constant threat from an early age means that the emotional brain is in survival mode most of the time. This leads to changes in the body that include elevated baseline heart rate, body temperature, and level of anxiety, as well as changes in hormone levels. As a result, youth are constantly on guard for potential threat, mistrustful of others, and overly reactive to trauma reminders. Youth may be quick to escalate, have more behavioral issues in school, and have increased difficulty learning. Under chronic threat, the thinking brain gets less use, and as a result is underdeveloped. Structures in this region of the brain are smaller, and there are fewer connections in areas responsible for thinking, planning, focusing, problem solving, and identifying and managing emotions. Youth have more difficulties with activities related to learning, such as concentrating, processing and remembering new information, acquiring new skills, and regulating emotions. When a child's brain and body is wired for survival, paying attention to seemingly non-critical information in the classroom is very difficult. Take a look at this slide. Dr. Dan Siegel has developed a visual method of illustrating the information we just summarized regarding the structure of the brain using your hand. Take a moment to watch this short video that explains this visual model and demonstrates a strategy for returning an overstimulated brain to a more normal state.
Hold your hand up like this, fold your thumb in, close your fingers down. This is a model of your brain. So the eyes, if there is a head here, they'd be looking out the front this way. This is the outside of that brain, that wrinkly part you see when you see a brain. And at the very front, right behind your forehead here, the smart part, the prefrontal cortex. It makes the decisions. Now inside, you can't see it, but we're gonna open it up like this and we're gonna see the thumb area and down here in the palm. These two areas work together. The limbic system, the emotions, the feelings part. When you feel scared, when you're really angry, when you're out of control and you're upset and you can't think straight. And here, the brain stem keeps your heart beating and your lungs breathing and makes you move your hand away from a hot stove really quickly. These two areas working together saves your life from a tiger. It sends out a warning signal, danger, danger, and our heart beats. We breathe fast and shallow, our muscles tense so that we can run or we can fight and save our lives. Which is very handy if a tiger is chasing you. Not so handy if you're sitting in a classroom. Now what happens? The alarm will go off, and they're false alarms. You know false alarms in the school when the fire alarm goes off and there was no fire and we all have to leave the building anyway? Well, that's what happens here. Somebody might criticize you or your teacher tells you to sit down and please do your work and you get all upset. That's not a real alarm. You're not really in danger. Yet, the alarm is set and you flip your lid. You lose the smart part. And this part is now in control. What can you do to get this smart part back? Start breathing slow, in through your nose, out through your nose, way down into your belly. Let your shoulders go. Relax, relax. Relax your body and breathe. This will trick this part. Look what's happening. The smart part. You get your smart part back. Because whatever got you upset, most of the time, is a false alarm.
When toxic stress is experienced, it can fundamentally alter the physiology and function of the brain. In essence, as you've previously heard, it can overactivate the stress response system to various degrees, which, in essence, results in the individual being constantly in survival mode, thus making cognitive thoughts and logical problem solving far more challenging. Take a moment to look at this screen. Hit pause if you need more time. The screen that follows is a brain scan of a healthy and a deprived brain. Note the differences as a result of toxic stress. As a summary of our learning thus far, let's walk through the stress response. The emotional brain senses a threat and sounds the alarm that sends a message to the body to react. This happens at an automatic and unconscious level. For example, if you hear a loud noise, you immediately jump before you even know whether you are in danger. It is most important to remember that when faced with a potential threat, we react first and think second. The thinking brain assesses the situation to see whether the danger is real or just a false alarm. If the thinking brain confirms the threat is real, it temporarily goes offline, and the emotional brain takes over and starts the fight or flight response. Hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol, are released to give the body the energy to fight or flee, and to calm down once the threat has passed, similar to the gas and brake pedals in a car. Changes that happen when the stress response is activated include increased heart rate and blood pressure, rapid breathing, sweating, tunnel vision, and difficulty thinking clearly. When neither fighting nor fleeing is an option in the moment, we may freeze or shut down during a threatening situation. For younger children who cannot fight or flee, shutting down may be their best option for dealing with overwhelming stress. Once the threat has passed, the thinking brain helps shut off the alarm, and the body puts the brakes on to allow us to calm down and come back into balance. So, can stress become toxic? In a word, yes. Toxic stress can occur when a child experiences adversity that is extreme, long-lasting, and severe without adequate support from a caregiving adult. Specifically, childhood adversities, including ACEs, can overactivate the child's stress response system, wearing down the body and brain over time. This overactivation is referred to as toxic stress and is the primary way in which adversity damages a child's development and well-being. The extent to which a child's stress response to adversity becomes toxic and leads to serious health and mental health problems in adulthood also depends on the child's biological makeup, the characteristics of the adverse events or conditions, and the depth and array of protective factors in their life. Now that you have a better understanding of what trauma is and how the brain reacts to trauma, we will now look at what educators may see in the classroom with students that may be experiencing or have experienced trauma in the past.
Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn.
As we stated earlier, trauma happens at a point in time, not in isolation. The effects of trauma are connected to the place where the child is in their development. Getting their developmental needs met is interrupted by trauma. Typically, a child's experience of traumatic events will depend on the following: age of onset, severity, frequency, duration, and extent of injury. So how does trauma impact our students? The majority of school-age youth have been or will be exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event, including experiencing a traumatic event directly, witnessing this event, or just hearing about an event that affects someone a student knows. Whether these experiences happen at home, in the community, or at school, the effects of trauma can be felt at school. As children are exposed to more traumatic experiences, the negative impact on social and academic success becomes more pronounced. Students exposed to trauma may have any of the following reactions: physical symptoms such as headaches, stomach aches, poor appetite, and a decline in self-care; intense feelings of fear, anxiety, and concern for their safety; difficulty identifying how they are feeling and controlling their emotional reactions; angry or aggressive outbursts; a desire to withdraw from peers and adults; a tendency to engage in risk-taking behaviors; and trouble trusting adults and peers, reading social cues, and building relationships. So how does trauma impact our students? The majority of school-age youth have been or will be exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event, including experiencing a traumatic event directly, witnessing this event, or just hearing about an event that affects someone a student knows. Whether these experiences happen at home, in the community, or at school, the effects of trauma can be felt at school. As children are exposed to more traumatic experiences, the negative impact on social and academic success becomes more pronounced. Students exposed to trauma may have any of the following reactions: physical symptoms such as headaches, stomach aches, poor appetite, and a decline in self-care; intense feelings of fear, anxiety, and concern for their safety; difficulty identifying how they are feeling and controlling their emotional reactions; angry or aggressive outbursts; a desire to withdraw from peers and adults; a tendency to engage in risk-taking behaviors; and trouble trusting adults and peers, reading social cues, and building relationships. The impact of trauma on school performance can be profound. The effects of trauma exposure on student performance may manifest in any of the following ways. Take a look. Trauma can also impact staff and teachers. School staff may bring their own history or current experiences of trauma to their work, or experience trauma on the job, for example, being threatened or assaulted, or witnessing violence in school. Staff struggling with their own trauma may have any of the following reactions listed below. As educators, it is also really important to be aware of the impact of trauma on staff in regards to secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. The term secondary traumatic stress refers to the presence of PTSD symptoms caused by indirect exposure to other people's traumatic experiences. Another term used to describe STS is compassion fatigue. Symptoms of STS for staff may include increased anxiety and concern about safety, intrusive negative thoughts and images related to their students' traumatic stories, fatigue and physical complaints, feeling numb or detached from students, feeling powerless or hopeless about students and their work, diminished concentration and difficulty with decision-making, and a desire to physically or emotionally withdraw from people or situations that trigger difficult thoughts and emotions. The term vicarious trauma refers to the cumulative effect of working with traumatized students and their families, which leads to negative changes in how staff view themselves, others, and the world. This phenomenon, vicarious trauma, may manifest as increased difficulty leaving work at work, increased irritability with coworkers and students, diminished energy and patience, doubts about professional capabilities and impact, and questions about the value and purpose of the work. These symptoms can extend into staff members' personal lives in ways that include feeling disconnected from family and friends, avoiding activities that used to be enjoyable, and having less empathy and emotional availability for others. It is important to keep in mind that outward behaviors always have an internal origin. Even if we don't know the antecedent trigger or cause of a behavior, we can't say there isn't one. When a student is looking outwardly agitated or withdrawn, for example, we need to dig deeper to look below the surface to see what the internal origin of that behavior might be. One illustration could look like this. Children often present with behaviors that look like the shark, but if we look below the water, we'll realize that they are really just scared goldfish trying to have a need met. Their behaviors might communicate anger and hostility, but below the surface is fear and a hurting child. It's our job as educators to stop focusing on the shark fin and look below the surface and meet the needs of the goldfish. Another visual example could be the iceberg analogy. What we see on the surface is only a small portion of the iceberg. This is similar to what we see with individuals, especially those that have experienced trauma. We may only see outward behaviors such as aggression, verbal threats, or withdrawal. What is under the surface is much more. Under the surface, we need to look at their emotional and relational health. Addressing these needs that are under the surface is the only way to change what we see on top of the water. If students are currently experiencing trauma or have a history of past trauma, they may encounter situations that trigger a reaction related to that circumstance. It's not always easy to predict when a student may be triggered. Some common triggers may include encountering unpredictable situations or sudden changes and transitions. A loss of control, rejection, disapproval, and confrontation can also trigger a reaction in students related to past trauma. Other factors, such as a loud or chaotic environment, can be challenging for students that have a history of trauma. Keep in mind, each individual's experiences are different, and triggers will vary as well. When an individual encounters a trigger and begins to have an emotional response, it is typically not a quick 0 to 60 and back to 0 type response. A child will move through the agitation and acceleration phases on their way to their peak emotional reaction before the de-escalation and recovery process begins. Each individual child will experience this cycle in their own timeline. The sooner we as educators can recognize this cycle and intervene with supports, we may be able to help the child cope and not reach such an extreme level of peak emotional reaction. This section of the module will define trauma-informed care and why it is important for classrooms and school communities. Best practice suggests that we, as educators, put trauma-informed care practices in place to support all students, whether we know their history of trauma or not. Like universal design for learning, but with trauma. Trauma-informed care can be defined as care that is provided with an acute awareness of the survivor's traumatic experiences and care that is taken to honor the survivor's experiences and its effects. We may not always know if our students have experienced trauma, so making these practices part of our classroom culture can benefit every student. A trauma-informed classroom or school culture has many components. It typically starts with training for all staff and the assurance of administrative commitment to integrating a trauma-informed culture into the school culture. The road to trauma-informed care also includes both the providers of the care and the providers in the planning and evaluation of services. It may also include the development of an internal trauma team. The evaluation process in a trauma-informed school culture includes conducting early and respectful trauma screenings and assessments for all individuals and takes care to address any potential re-traumatization policies and procedures. As you are likely aware, because you're going through this module, the issue of trauma is being increasingly talked about in schools and across communities. This is, of course, a very good thing. Interestingly but surprisingly, the more these conversations occur, it becomes clear that the language used needs to be accurate and clear as well. The terms trauma-informed and trauma-specific is an example of confusion over language in the field, as they both sound similar and can connote care for students. The key difference between these two forms of care is that trauma-specific services are clinical interventions, whereas trauma-informed approaches address the nature of the overall school and classroom culture in a manner associated with practices that create conducive learning environments. In light of this understanding, trauma-informed approaches become the primary preventive focus in schools, with trauma-specific services collaboratively brought in to play at the advanced tiers when providing multi-tiered systems of support. Congratulations! You made it to the final section of the training module. In this section, we'll be discussing consideration and strategies to support individuals that have experienced trauma. Most individuals are resilient, and the supports we put in place as educators can increase that resiliency and lead to better long-term outcomes for our students. Given these high prevalence rates, the logical question is, how do most kids respond to trauma? The majority of children and adolescents that experience trauma or a traumatic event are sufficiently resilient, or they develop sufficient degrees of resiliency in the aftermath of those traumatic experiences. In other words, despite exposure to traumatic events and experiencing short-term distress, most children and adolescents return to their previous levels of functioning after several weeks or perhaps months following the traumatic experience and resume their typical development pathway. The degree of resilience of a given youth is directly related to the balance between risk and protective factors in that youth's life. The lower the number of risk factors and the greater the array and number of protective factors equals the greater likelihood of sufficient levels of resilience to navigate life experiences, including traumatic events. It's also important to note that resilience is not static in nature, rather it is dynamic, which means it can change over time, in large part in association with the presence of protective factors. Acknowledging this balance between risk and protective factors is not surprising that youth who have been exposed to multiple traumas, have a past history of anxiety problems or depression, or have experienced family adversity along with other forms of adverse childhood experiences, tend to be at higher risk of showing symptoms of acute stress disorder or even post-traumatic stress disorder following exposure to a traumatic event. Safety. When considering safety, we must look at both the physical and the psychological safety of our students and staff in the classroom. As educators, we need to ensure procedures are in place to create and maintain a safe physical environment for everyone in our schools. We must also focus on creating and maintaining interpersonal relationships that safeguard the psychological needs of our students. Trustworthiness and transparency. These are the focus of the second key principle of trauma-informed care. Trust is the foundation for strong relationships and growth in the classroom. As educators, we should strive to foster that trust through transparent, open, and honest communication with our students. Peer support is the third key principle of trauma-informed care. In this context, we refer to peers as individuals that have experienced trauma. These individuals are also sometimes referred to as trauma survivors. The support that those that have experienced trauma can offer to one another is of great value in establishing safety and hope in the community of peers. Peers that utilize their shared experiences can help build recovery and healing together. Collaboration and mutuality is the fourth key principle of trauma-informed care. The focus here should be on shared responsibility and decision-making so that no one person is felt to have all the power. Avoiding power struggles by leveling the playing field gives each individual a role to play in what happens in the classroom and school community. The fifth principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. Each individual's experiences have value, and these experiences, when shared, can empower students to grow and learn together. As educators, we can cultivate self-advocacy skills and guide students in goal-setting activities to increase their sense of voice and choice. As a group, we can celebrate individual and shared group success to further increase the sense of empowerment in our classrooms. The final principle is addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues. We must actively work to address these issues as they arise as educators in our classrooms and community. Our processes and procedures must be responsive to these issues and not further create more division. As educators, we can also work to address historical trauma that has occurred across generations, such as trauma toward communities of color or the LGBTQ community. Let's now return to the objective slide that we looked at the beginning of this module. Remember, the purpose of this module was really as an introduction to introduce and define trauma and ACEs, the impact that it has on brain development, and the effects that you may see in the classroom as a result of someone experiencing trauma. We very briefly touched on some strategies to support individuals in trauma, but we will dig into that more deeply in a second module that's being created, which should prove helpful to you in translating your understanding of trauma and ACEs into real instructional practices in the classroom.